Hello and welcome to A Word with Ward, a podcast focused on the high-growth world of data centers. In Series 1, I speak with some of the most prominent entrepreneurs of the industry. Those who've either already founded, scaled and exited businesses in this space, or who are currently on that journey. If you've got an interest in the industry, these are the people that you're going to want to hear from. I think I'm going to learn a thing or two along the way, and if you give it a listen, you might too. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Bill Barney, Chairman of Asian Century Equity and co-founder and chairman of Modularity, a startup providing American-built modular edge data centers and modular cable landing station solutions across fast-growing emerging markets. Bill previously founded and operated as CEO Asian edge data center business Turbidac, which he sold in 2023. Bill has an impressive non-executive director portfolio career advising PE investors such as EQT and Helios on their data center investments, as well as serving on a number of data center boards. Prior to this, he had an incredibly successful 25-year executive career in Asia as CEO for Global Cloud Exchange, Relight Communications, and PacNet, and earlier senior roles at MCI Worldcon and Orange, just to name a few. Okay, hi Bill, good afternoon and good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Ward.
Now, I've already given the listeners an introduction to you and your executive career, your founder journey with Turbidac and some of your non-exec roles. But I did want to start off because we've got an announcement that's hot off the press, and that's your most recent entrepreneurial venture, Modularity, which was officially unveiled a couple of days before we're recording this episode. So could you start off by telling us all about Modularity, please?
Sure. Modularity is actually it's a an acquisition of a company or JV with a company called AMSS, which has been actually operating for 10 or 12 years. And their past, they built data centers, small data centers for largely the U.S. government in sort of remote spots. For example, they've done things in Alaska, some of the Caribbean islands, parts of Africa, etc. And in fact, they actually built the embassy in Baghdad, for example, is one of the projects they did. So this is a team that we've moved into Modularity and announced. And that we will now be focusing on largely building small data centers between 1 and 10 megawatts and landing stations. But also as part of the focus of the company, we'll also do some submarine cables as well. So we are involved in a number of cable projects. So not only will we build the endpoints, but we'll help build the branching units and all the other parts of the ecosystem in various cables.
Great. Okay. And can you talk to me a little bit more about your ambition to launch this business? How did it all come about, and what is it you guys want to achieve?
Well, I think that my last business, Turbidac, was largely focused on edge computing. And one of the things that we found was, while there is a huge focus today on AI and large data centers, or what they call hyperscalers, there was a very limited focus on getting content and computer capabilities closer to the end user through the edge. And the edge had been largely neglected, and is becoming the area that folks, when you start thinking about self-driving cars, you start thinking about drones, many of the new technology, they need to actually get access to servers in a very, very close proximity. And we realized that there's very few companies that actually can do this, and also can do it quickly and do it out of the United States. One of the things that we bring to the table is we're American made. So we build in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. We actually deliver these all over the world. It's 100% American technology on the inside. And it can be all the way up to EMP class type rooms where, at maximum level of security. So we're capable of going the full gambit from sort of low-tech buildings up to some of the most secure and high-powered buildings that you can deploy into networks.
Great. Okay. And could you talk to me a little bit about what your role is specifically in the business, and who else is involved?
Sure. Yeah, my last few roles have been as a CEO, and I think this is my first role as sort of an executive chairman. I will eventually name a CEO to run the business. Haven't started. That will probably happen over the next 3 to 4 months. But for the moment, I'll be running the business, but I'll continue as a board member. But it's part of as you go later in your career, you start to realize that you want to do a lot of things, not just one thing. And typically, sort of these small ventures tend to require 100% of your time if you're the CEO. And so, the challenge right now is how do I spread myself out so I can do other things. And so I'm excited about being sort of an investor, executive chairman, and it's a role that I've played on a number of companies of late. And that's been sort of, I guess, sort of the next step that you take always in your career as you move out of the C-suite into the sort of director suite, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're almost at day dot of the business, but what can we expect to see in 2024 from Modularity?
2024, you should hear about us in. We're pretty confident that we've got. I would say contracts very, very close in the Middle East, also in the Pacific, and then we're executing on a fairly large initiative in the country of Iceland. So we've 3 areas that we've and we're all over the globe. Obviously, we're focused on those, and that's just to say where we are today. That's what's been occupying our time for the first few months of the operation.
Sure. Okay. Well, wish you all the best growing that business. And I wanted to look. You moved to Asia from the States back in the 90s and had
Yes.
an incredible 20-year plus senior executive career there within major telco and data center companies. So look, I'd like to take you back to the tail end of the 90s and talk about what originally took you over to Asia and why you decided to spend over 2 decades there.
Well, I think Asia's always been a spot on the planet that's exciting for many. It's the statistics are amazing. It's almost half the world's population. If you think about the folks that are in their youth, it's got one of the youngest populations, newly educated. Every demographic on a population basis or education basis is going in a positive direction. And obviously, the economies have been powerful. They've had very, very high growth economies. Obviously, where there's high growth, there's also occasionally small snafus where they actually go into crisis and sort of come out of control and then go back into growth. So it was a pretty exciting part of the world. At the time that I came out, I was I was late 20s. Wanted to go somewhere there where I knew that all the boats were going to float if you went out there, and I was offered an opportunity with a joint venture with it was a German, French, and American joint venture called Global One to go out and run a portion of Asia. And from there, I essentially expanded that role to eventually running Asia and the Middle East. And then I was pulled into MCI right at the inflection period of sort of when they were on their acceleration period with a company called UUNet also. So I ran UUNet and MCI. And that was probably for me when I saw how powerful the Asian market was, because we essentially, when I came to the business, it was $35 million. 2 years later, it had more than $1 billion of revenue, to give you some idea. So that's how fast these things accelerated. And it was, we were moving from office, we'd put people in an office and then we'd fill up the boardroom with people and then we'd find another office. I mean, it was, we went from essentially a few hundred people to, 3,000-4,000 people in 2 years. So phenomenal growth. And I'd never seen hyper growth like that. And I haven't seen it since. But it was a pretty amazing thing. So that sort of got the bug in me at the time. And then the exciting opportunity was given to me to go run, to be a CEO of a public company, which was Asia Global Crossing at the time. That happened to be probably one of the more mistimed situations, because that was right at the beginning of the telecom crisis. And so as I was negotiating my position, the company, its parent, went into bankruptcy, and we would eventually get pulled in there with it. But it was fun. I learned about a whole different part of the market, which was the distressed side and how that all works. And we actually took it through and restructured it and brought it out, and it became a successful company that I ran for 12 years. And so it was a pretty exciting asset. At one point, we controlled about 60 to 70% of all the submarine cables in Asia were under our control at one point. Since then, obviously, there have been new cables built, but at one point, we were in a very, very powerful position. So it was interesting. And then from there, I went to run Reliance in India, which is a fantastic company that I learned a lot. It was same thing. It was sort of a crisis company. At the time, it was over leveraged and there was new entrants coming in, and it was a very challenging period. But it was an opportunity to learn about India, which I thought was probably one of the more interesting spots on the planet. So it's been. I mean, did I go out to Asia with a view of being there 26 years? No, I went out there with a view of being there for 2 or 3 years, and it just kept feeding on itself. And I had fun, and so I just kept going.
Great. Okay. And can you talk to me a little bit about what you did with your last company, Turbidac, which, from my understanding, you founded that and flipped it relatively quickly within a couple of years. So I'd love to understand a bit more about that process.
Yeah, Turbidac was an interesting one because it was a company that was conceived during COVID, sort of funded during COVID. Almost the amazing thing was that I would say that probably 95% of all the meetings and transactions all happened over Zoom, which was it was in the Zoom world. We didn't travel anywhere. We didn't meet our partners. We didn't, all the relationships were built during that. But it was very interesting. We were owned by New World Development, and they actually backed us. We were in the process of building data centers. We had plans and in some cases legal agreements to build in Guam, the Philippines, and we were also looking very heavily into the Middle East. But we also came to a challenging point, which sometimes happens with these. This is when the China-U.S. situation became very, very pronounced, and our largest customer in the first data center that we were building in the Pacific Islands happened to be one of the big over-the-top players in the U.S., and they had a lot of restrictions on who could actually own the data center. So we were one of the first trial cases of trying to deal with that. So in order to actually make the company valuable in a very, very quick period of time, we had to find a new investor to replace the guys that had actually founded us. They did not. Their plan had been to keep us for 3 to 5 years, but they also recognized at the time that the challenge was you're going to have these. There was a lot of stress, I would say, between the United States and China, and being in the infrastructure business and trying to deal with the U.S. over the top players as a Chinese operator was not going to be successful. We knew, unless we were going to stay in China. If we stayed and built stuff in Hong Kong or in mainland China, we would have been fine. But if we wanted to go elsewhere, it was going to be a challenge because we were going to be up against a lot of force. So we ended up with a great outcome. We managed to sell the company back to actually our partner in Guam that actually acquired it, and essentially there was an earnout structure, but it was good for all parties. I think everyone made money through the process, and so it was a good outcome, and it was a very interesting outcome because we actually, it wasn't until after we closed the sale that I actually got a chance to meet the buyer in person. So it was that's how it was. Just such a weird period during COVID that but the amazing thing was that you could actually pull something off like this, where you could essentially set up a company, build it, operate, get it going, and then essentially, and we were constructing a site overseas from a Zoom room, essentially. So it was pretty impressive, but pretty interesting, but not something I want to do again. I think you do need to have the human side of it. You need the relationships. You need to be able to go out and actually see the assets and things. But it was a good experiment during the Zoom period, and I think one of the success stories. So for me, it was interesting. My first time as sort of an entrepreneur, starting a company from a sheet of paper and building it from there. So it was interesting, and it was a good story for all of us.
Yeah, very interesting that I've had 3 guests on the podcast now who all founded a business within the middle of the global pandemic. So, yeah.
Well, we had to do something, right? It was a...
Thanks for listening to A Word with Ward. We're not funded by anybody, so we don't have any hidden agenda. We're just talking to some of the most interesting people in data centers. We have had some help creating some of the questions from Sixth Sense Consulting, business psychologists and executive coaches for teams and individuals. We partner with Sixth Sense during the assessment phase when delivering executive search assignments. If you've got any burning questions you want to ask a data center entrepreneur in Series 1, please drop me an email at ward@thewayofward.com. Before the break, me and Bill were talking about his most recent startup, Modularity, what took him to Asia for an incredible 20-plus year executive career, and his previous startup, Turbidac. Next, we're going to talk about his transition into non-executive director work, including advice on how to do that, the future of the industry, and what people aren't talking about that he thinks they should be. Look, we've done a bit of work together on the non-executive director side of things. You've got a very interesting and diverse regional non-executive director portfolio. Can you maybe talk to me around some of that, and also how you went about transitioning from your executive career into the non-executive space?
Well, I think part of it is actually I had pretty good mentors over the years. I had guys like Afshin Mohibi, who's at TPG, or Phil Kuhn, who was former CEO of Savvis, but just some great people that always gave great advice, and they did it freely. And one of the great pieces of advice they gave me is, become a director early on in your career. Do some of the sort of the stuff that you want to do later in your career when you're valuable, right? So because when you're a CEO, you're valuable to be on the board. When you're just unless you've got a great track record, it's harder. So it's sometimes better to do it at that point and to start getting a reputation of being able to do this. And so I started going on boards, I think, probably 10 years ago. So it's something that I enjoy. It's a different way of operating, because if you're a former CEO, your inclination is to try and become the CEO when you're a director, and you have to realize that every CEO has their own personality, they have their own way, and they need to find their way, and they need space from the directors as well. So you're there to help guide them, to give them advice, and in some cases help them with decisions or make decisions in ugly situations. Sometimes you actually have to make hard decisions. But the reality is, for the most part, your job is to help them get to, from point A to point B, and also to get them to be the best version of themselves, right? And that's what you're trying to do as a director. And it's different in different markets, right? So, thank you for helping me get into Africa. I've really enjoyed that. The Helios team is probably one of the better groups of folks that are operating in what is an extremely challenging sort of underdeveloped sector compared to Asia, where I was largely spent the rest of my career. And then I've been fortunate to be with Control S, so I've done quite a bit with them over the years, and it's been great. Before that, I actually worked with TA in a satellite company. So one of the things I've tried to do is learn about things that I didn't know as much about. So the satellite company was fantastic for me a few years ago. We took it public. Unfortunately, I had to leave right in the middle because I had to take another CEO job. So that was actually my first sort of independent. That was an Australian listed company, Speedcast. Unfortunately, it didn't finish well, but that was about 7 years after I left. But it was an interesting company with Speedcast, with TA, a group out of Boston, who's a very, very good private equity group, and worked very closely with them. So yeah, I've had I can't complain. I've had some great opportunities given to me to sort of be in these companies and help them take them to the next step. And it's fun. It's fun to watch the CEOs grow and succeed. So no, I've absolutely enjoyed it. In fact, it's just a great way to. It's a less stress way of actually watching how the boardroom dynamics and helping it get to the next place.
Yeah, and if there was, if there's any executives who are, nearing the end of their exec career, considering getting into NED work, what is there any advice you could offer them in terms of making that transition in terms of how to do it and how to approach it differently to an exec role?
Well, I think it's part of it is right now. There's sort of there's different boards you can go on. You can go on what I call the public boards, which are the big listed companies, which is a certain kind of director. It's a lot of legal issues to it, and you sort of have to have a certain profile to do that. And you're generally just dealing with a lot of statutory issues and sort of budgets, and then occasionally there'll be M&A stuff that'll come across your desk. But for the most part, you're dealing with just very, very structured environment. And that's one good area, but I would say it's not as exciting. I would say that the secondary is more the unlisted companies that are either owned by private equity, family offices, that are sort of, up to a couple $1 billion in value, but are actually on the accelerating side of things. So they're growing, and you can actually add to them. So you can actually be a part of their growth and help them move forwards. And I think that's those types of boards. If you're a person like me, you get a lot more out of those boards than you do necessarily of being on the public boards. Obviously, it's prestigious to be on a Fortune 100 company board, and it's great, but the reality is, do you really move the meter that much when you're sitting there? Whereas to a smaller company, you actually can have a very dramatic impact. You can help. You can make the CEO better. You can make them think about their business model differently, and you're actually more of a partner than necessarily a watchdog sitting on the board. So I would say that's just. But different people want different things. I would say sort of the public boards typically are not as much time. So you don't have to spend as much time, and it's also very rigid. So you can actually when the next meeting's going to be. When you're in a small company, the meeting could be tomorrow, and you don't know it's there yet until today. So it's but that's also the kind of the fun of it, and the things that I think make it interesting and exciting.
Yeah, great. And from a practical point of view, is there any advice you can give to someone in terms of how they should go about securing that type of a role? Is it something that
Yeah, sorry. I probably should have answered that question first, which is, the second set of boards that I talked about. It's really about knowing sort of the private equity folks generally, or the family offices. It's who actually owns these companies. It's getting to know the owners and doing it in a way that you're not necessarily going right there and saying, "Hey, I want to be a director of your company," but it's actually just getting to know who they are, getting to know their problems, helping them sort of think things through, and actually getting them to get to know you. Because I think one of the challenges in a smaller company is that they want to know that the personality is going to fit with the way they operate. In the public side, I think it's important to make sure that you've got a lot of the certifications. You want to make sure that you've done, in many cases, well documented stuff that you've got in your background, I think helps. So if you're an accountant, for example, or have an accounting background, it's very, very helpful in the public board sector to get that out there. And there's also those boards are largely sourced by headhunters. Whereas, and there's a subset of 4 or 5 that do the big public boards. And, I would just get to know those 4 or 5 executive search firms, and get on their radar, and get on the radar early. And then I would say at the private companies, there's probably a bigger network of executive search firms, but I think it's a combination of those executive search firms plus understanding and knowing the principals and the owners of these assets. So it's a combination of both to be successful.
Yeah, great advice. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a couple of questions I've been asking to most guests. Now, the first one is quite broad, so please feel free to answer it any way you choose. But what do you see as the future of the data center sector?
It's interesting. That question was asked to me this morning, and I think it's sort of we're heading in a path that's going to be interesting. There's a there's some large companies in the world that they may choose at some point to actually build their own data centers and become, and that may be the very largest data centers in the world. Maybe actually the owners are the occupiers of those centers, which may be the direction it goes in. I don't know. It's hard to say. I think it also depends on how much AI becomes mainstreamed and how quickly. And because I think the faster it becomes mainstreamed, that changes the dynamics because there aren't enough people in these companies to build them fast enough. If if it accelerates at the pace it's going now, if it slows down, they potentially could do that. But I also think there's going to be a world where there's always going to be data centers across the board. Are they valued as I would say right now they're probably valued a bit higher than the reality of where they should be versus other digital infrastructure assets. Because you think about it, towers trade sort of 12 to 15 times, and fiber trades at 6 and 7 times. I would say that the reality is all three of them are required in the digital ecosystem. They'll all sort of trade, I think, towards a balance, even though data centers for the last 12 years have sort of traded much higher than the other two sort of asset classes. I think eventually they'll all sort of come to sort of a similar area because all three are required. All three have equal. And I would actually say it's harder to build a fiber network than it is to build a data center or even a tower network, to be honest. So the reality is, I think that's, and I think the other trend that you're going to see with the data center industry is I think you're going to see data centers not necessarily going towards population centers where they build hyperscalers. You're going to see those chasing power and chasing green power. And I think you'll start to see, I think you saw a recent asset that was put in the Nordics. There's a big power center that was actually built in Japan that was really, essentially put where there's actually a massive power plant going. But I think over time, you're going to see that data centers are actually going to move in the direction of where they can get low cost power and low cost green power because they are not going to want to be the poster child of the polluters of the planet at the end of the day. And they're heading in that direction if they don't move in that direction. And we saw this a little bit with Bitcoin. If you looked at Bitcoin, for example, it was drawing down massive amounts of power, and it actually became public enemy for a while with a lot of these governments saying, I don't need these guys coming in chewing up all the electricity in my country, and we should move them out. So I think this is, reality is, I think the data center, if their industry needs to start to look at, where's places they can do, where they can be greener, where they can focus and sort of shift away. Because the reality is fiber can bring you close to anywhere in a matter of seconds by essentially building cables between locations. So I think and under AI, you don't necessarily have to have high speed cables between them. You actually just have to have massive cables running between assets.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Can you talk to me a little bit about what, in your opinion, people in the industry are not talking about that they should be?
Well, I think the things that I think they're going to become very interesting are we've been, you look at terrorism and you look at all the challenges in the world where wars have been fought. They've largely been fought between people and armies and sort of military shooting missiles and things at each other. We're about to head into a new world where essentially people may take out infrastructure in a way to disrupt countries. And when you start thinking about all of the things that run through this digital infrastructure, it's basically the backbone of every country. And the reality is it's not well protected. It could be disrupted. And so I think that's going to be one of the big challenges. I think that's challenge one. I think challenge two, obviously people are starting to think about AI and all the positives that it brings, but it's also, it potentially, if not managed, could be used for very negative things. It can create killer viruses. It can create bombs. It can do things that nobody, that are unthinkable, right? And so I think one of the things that we have to think about is we're going to a new world. And the third thing I would say is, as a planet right now, and even as countries, we're really divided. And the reality is, and there's no real fact-based world that we're living in right now. And I think if this continues and you have the opportunity for the bad guys to do some bad stuff, we really could be into an interesting circus in the next couple of years. And I think it's one of the things is the world has to kind of come together and realize that, we need to work together. And I think one of the things that has been great with the tech industry, and I would say the telecom industry, is that the partnership. It's interesting because we were just talking the other day about, for example, the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians. Even though there's all these issues between the countries, the telecom operators are still interconnecting our networks. We're still talking to each other. We're sharing data. We're moving stuff around. And the reality is there's an ecosystem of collaboration that's been there and mutual respect. And even when there's problems, like Chinese, like famous example is in 2006 when the Taiwan earthquake happened and the world was taken out. We were running the largest submarine cable in the region, and we ran all of our traffic through mainland China because we couldn't get from Hong Kong to Japan. And the Chinese stepped up and gave us everything they had and this is for all the Western traffic. It was Google, it was all the big Western guys. And so I think our industry is a good example of how you can actually collaborate and work together. And I think the world needs to sort of think that through and sort of, because I think we're at a place where if we continue down this really kind of divided and, type environment, all these things could be put to negative use. And that's something that we really don't want to have happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Finally, you've been affiliated with PTC for, forever, really. You're the chairman. I understand there's a new event that's being launched over in the DC area later this year. So can you maybe talk to us a little bit about what's to come there?
Yeah, no, and it's exactly on this as the point I just when we're talking about what's bringing the world together. The point of the PTC has been for 25, 30 years, at least as long as I've been there. It's been the place where people from all over the world come to talk about issues, and originally it was about how to exchange telephone traffic, then it was data traffic, and now it's about building data centers and building infrastructure together. And I think it's been a real kind of meeting point. And one of the things that we've noticed is that in the last 20 years, the governments have become less involved with the private sector. So the private sector is kind of set up, and all this infrastructure has largely been between commercial entities, but not the governments. And yet the governments, are the recipients of whatever's happening, whether it be the new social network or the new technology or cloud or whatever. Whatever comes into these countries, they are the beneficiary. And so the idea that we had was, why don't we create a mid-year where we can bring governments together to talk to the private sector. So actually have and talk about the Pacific. So really specifically get them involved with what PTC knows really well, which is the Pacific region, the Pacific Islands, and all of the countries in Asia, and say, what can we do together? And what do you want to do in Asia? Mr. USA and Mr. Australia, and Mr. Japan, Mr. China. What do you guys think is the what you're trying to accomplish in that part of the world? And then how can we work with you to make sure that happens, and also that we all build networks that work, that are secure, and that we have a way of operating together in a region which is becoming more and more congested as the population grows and people these economies become bigger and bigger. So that's what really the point is, and it's going to be the first time we're going to have not to pre-announce anything, but we'll have some fairly senior government officials on many different from numerous countries sort of talking, and then some of the top private equity and investment professionals in our field all coming together, and also some academics. So it's also some of the folks in the universities to sort of talk about what's theoretically what's possible and not possible. And so I think it's going to be a great melting pot in Washington. It's an experiment, and we're trying to find a way to. One of the things that I've pushed since I've been chairman is trying to create communication between groups rather than sort of silos. And if we can be a small microcosm of that in the world where people get together and talk to each other about all these big issues, I think it's a start towards collaboration around the world. And so we're excited about it.
Yeah, sounds like a really interesting event. Okay, Bill. Well, look, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed talking to you, as I always do. And all the best with everything that you do, but in particular with your new venture, Modularity.
Thank you, Ward. Enjoyed it.